recording, but there we go. I'm going to make sure stream is working everywhere. Perfect. Boom, 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 boom.
By the way, if we should lose electricity, I have my cell phone next to me, so I'll go to a hotspot and see what happens.
All right.
And if so, we'll try and, but we're not expecting anything before 4 o'clock, so we should be safe.
I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic. Excellent.
Oh, wait a minute. We have to let me go to settings and me. My books are. Let me.
Oh yeah.
I can probably do it. The video. It should be the video. No, the virtual background.
Correct. Well, you go to video, and then you go settings, then video, and then you click the mirror camera button, and it'll flip everything.
Okay, did it?
There you go. Awesome. Well, hello everyone. As you're hopping on, we will, officially get started in like 1 minute. But I'm excited that Dom has not lost power in Florida, and he's not wet on his head. So the internet and electricity are working. So this is pretty exciting. For those of you, hopping online, feel free to drop in your comments. Let us know where you're coming from. That'd be great. And as we're going through, flow wise, know that I'll be able to save questions you put in chat, regardless of the platform you're watching on, and then I'll be able to pull them up and ask them in the Q&A time. So don't feel like you have to wait for the question for us to see it. I can save them all, and we can have fun with that. All right. Ohio, Illinois. From Israel. So
from Israel. Nice. Hi, Gabriel.
Excellent. And we got they have electricity in Tampa.
Yeah, Tampa. They were very lucky in Tampa. It was south of Tampa.
All right. Well, I'm going to hit record, and we can get started. There we go. All right. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I'm here with Dominic Crossan, henceforth called Dom. And we are going to have some fun today. Why? Fun? Well, one, a lot of times I podcast, I have to read large books, figure out how to do an interview. No, this time Dom says, look, I want to do a visual webinar, and then we can unpack it in the Q&A. So I didn't have to read a book, and he has managed to travel around the Holy Land, taking pictures, and said, I have a specific archeological discovery that changes how we understand the historical Jesus. Do you want to talk about that? Now, if you or me, could you imagine Dominic Crossan saying, hey, what would it be cool if we talked about the archeological discovery that changes how we understand Jesus the most? And I said, there's yes, and then there's oh hell yeah. So I did both of them. I'm super excited to be here. And for those of you joining live, remember you can drop in your questions. We'll tackle them at the end. For those of you joining later, hey, next time it's live, you should join. This is for Dom and I. We are testing out doing these kind of visual centered webinars, kind of as opposed to watching a talking head or just seeing us talk. How do you bring in the gifts of photography and the kind of research he did as an archaeologist and on site and leading tours through those areas? So at the end, when I email you about this afterwards and say, hey, here's the thing, you can share it with your friends and stuff, definitely let us know how this format works, because no one has to fly anywhere and you don't just have to watch heads. So that is the our goal. So I mean, anything you want to say, Dom, before we hop in and let you take over?
No, except as you can see, everyone now has their favorite library behind them in these webinars. So I put my favorite library behind me.
Do you know the author? Have you got him signed?
Yeah, yeah, signed by the author. He may not have read them though. I think what I'd like to do, Trip, is go immediately to our images, and we open the first images, and I can talk with the first image on there if that's okay. Then
Oh yeah, yeah. There we go.
All right, so we can take off. Our subject then today is the Galilee boat, and at the moment in Florida, we're not thinking so much of boats as of building the ark and a few other things like that. But here's what I want to do. As Tripp said, this is a visual program. That means not just me talking with an odd image here and there, it's image based. So we're talking about the Galilee boat. And I'm going to claim it's the most important archaeological discovery for understanding the historical Jesus. We're trying to see how he got going, how he got traction, how he actually got going. So that's the background. Let me go to the second one. Because I want to give tribute. The scene you're looking at is a painting. It's a painting by an archeological artist. That is the book Excavating Jesus that Jonathan Reed. Jonathan is from Laverne University in California, and he's a field archaeologist. He and I wrote that Excavating Jesus, beneath the stones, behind the texts in 2001. We went to the Holy Land and went around to all the excavations. And we got this magnificent, I think he is Hungarian-born Israeli, Balázs Balázs, to draw us specific images we wanted. We had to show him. Jonathan spent a lot of time with him, draw this, draw that, and he's a magnificent artist. So throughout this webinar, we'll be looking at them, and I want you to know who it is, Balázs Balázs. This is a scene, obviously, in which he has, as it were, incorporated down in the left corner, the Galilee boat into a scene from the 1st century, imagining it set at Capernaum with fishers all around. And this is going to be our subject, the Galilee boat. All right, let me go to the next image. 4 questions. I'm going to ask 4 questions. Now, they're not rhetorical questions, and they're not just setups. These are the questions that really I worked with. On one level, you could say, well, they're all simply saying the same question in different forms. Yes, that's quite true. If you answered any of these 4 questions, you get them all. But there certainly is a progression. And I'd like you to watch and sort of, how would I put it? Let these images flow into you, because they are taken, of course, in modern times in Galilee, but they were deliberately chosen as ones that Jesus could have seen. I mean, you're almost looking at even at an Iron Age landscape, but a Bronze Age landscape. So the images behind the questions, think of them as things Jesus could have seen, and think of when you get away from the crowds and everything else, what you can still see in Galilee. Okay, so my first question. Isn't it the obvious one? Why did Jesus happen when and where he happened? Why then, why there? Now, if you simply say, well, God's will or whatever, then you still have to ask, in a way, why did it work? So this is almost the basic question you ask in any historical situation. Why did that happen then and there? Why did that happen then and there? So that's my first question. Second question, or even you might even think of it as a variation on that one, as I said. And please watch the background. All right, another way of maybe asking the same thing. Question 2, why did John's Jordan baptism? I want to think about that. There's lots of water around. Why on the Jordan? John's Jordan baptism and Jesus's divine rule movements. So 2 movements. Why did those 2 movements happened in the territories of Herod Antipas in the 20s CE, Common Era. You could see it's a variation on the preceding question, but it's getting more specific now. We've introduced not only John the Baptist, but Herod Antipas. And the way to understand Jesus, understand John, and to understand John, understand Herod. So my next question, the third one, kind of focusing now a bit more on Antipas. Why did Herod Antipas provoke both John and Jesus in the 20s after ruling quietly for 25 years? He came in 4 BCE. And so what did he do in the 20s? I mean, what happened to provoke John? And we know he provoked John because he had to execute John. And I suspect the only reason Jesus wasn't executed by Antipas rather than Pilate is that Antipas was smart enough to figure, okay, you don't take out two popular prophets too close to one another. So Jesus was protected, I think, by the shadow of John's death in Galilee. So that's my third question. And maybe a fourth way to ask it, and I'm not using a scenery now from Galilee, why is there so much fishy stuff in the Gospels? I mean, if you want to say, well, multiplication of loaves and fishes, I don't know how that was done, some kind of well, who knows. But listen, if you're multiplying loaves and fishes, or fishes, we tend to forget the fishes real fast. John in chapter 6 of his gospel forgets the fish very fast. But who's controlling the fish is what the whole thing is about. And even if Jesus can miraculously control the fish, that might be treason. So that's my questions. Now, let's begin to try and answer them. And I want you to watch as I answer them, facts and interpretations. I'll try and draw attention when I'm saying, now here are the facts, here's my interpretation. If you don't agree with the interpretation, of course, the facts are still there, waiting to be interpreted. And in all of this, I'm not trying to read Antipas's mind. I'm trying to understand Antipas's actions. Why did he do that? That's an historical question. It's not enough to say somebody did this. You have to ask why. For example, Antipas moved his capital, Sepphoris, inland capital, above the beautiful Beit Natofa Valley. It's kind of up on a bit of a hillock, to Tiberias on the lakeshore. Now, why did he do that? First of all, you really don't move your capital because that will annoy everyone, really annoy everyone. So you have to have a reason to do it. Now, if your capital has an earthquake, that could be considered a hint from God to move, maybe. But you don't do that. You really don't move your capital because it is an hour of divine purpose, unless you have a serious question, serious reason, serious purpose. It will annoy everyone. It will annoy your rich counselors, because what do you do with a used villa? If I'm his sort of chief of command at Sepphoris, I can't transport my villa. I can't commute 20 miles. I'm going to be really annoyed. And so will the little poor alley scribe who comes in and can maybe do small contracts and stuff. He can't move from his farm. So you want to really annoy everyone? Try moving your capital. So 2 questions. Why did he move his capital? Why did he move it to the lakeshore? Those are real questions. And any scholar or archaeologist who talks about Antipas, quite frankly, and doesn't ask those questions, ain't doing scholarship, just doing gossip, which is fun too, but it's gossip. All right. Antipas. So now, for a moment, as it were, forget Jesus and John. Focus on Herod Antipas. I'm going to call him the man who would be king. And I'm saying that if you want to understand Antipas across about 43 years of his rule, understand this. He wanted to be king like his father. He wanted to be king of the Jews, of course, of the whole country, as Herod the Great was. That's his driving force. First of all, let me put it in the general matrix. He tried this under Augustus. When Herod the Great died in 4 BCE, his second last will, his penultimate will, suggested, subject of course to Augustus's approval, that Antipas should be in charge of the whole kingdom. At the last minute, he changed that to archeology, which was a major goof, by the way. But Antipas went to Rome in 4 BCE expecting to be made king of the Jews. And quite frankly, Augustus made a major strategic imperial blunder in not doing that, because two alternatives were presented to him by the Roman Jews, by a delegation of Jews from official delegation from Israel, and by the sister and family of Herod the Great. Make Antipas king of the Jews or integrate us into Syria as an ethnic enclave within Syria. In my viewpoint, Augustus' major goof, he should have done the latter. He should have simply made it part of Syria, because the Syrian governors were much better than guys like Pilate, by the way, sub-governors. So Herod Antipas came back, I think, with his tail between his legs in 4 BCE as a tetrarch, like a quarter monarch, a sort of a little nobody with two different pieces on either side of the Jordan that weren't even integrated together, while his brother, Archelaus, became the ethnarch, Judea, Samaria. He lasted 10 years, by the way. It was a disastrous decision. He was dumped after 10 years in 6 CE. But back to Antipas, he tried under Augustus. Jump to Caligula, the third emperor. He tried again under Caligula. He went to Rome with his new wife Herodias to become king of the Jews, ended up in exile somewhere on the Riviera. By the way, what's wrong with being exiled to the Riviera? Anyway, so now put Tiberius in the middle. You got Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula. Under Tiberius, he comes in 14 CE with the death of Augustus. At that point, Herod makes his second move of the three, the second move to become king of the Jews. What he has to do to become king of the Jews? Well, supposing he could really up his tax revenues in Galilee. Supposing he really upped them. Now, he has to do that without pushing his peasants into revolt, because that's a good way to become an ex-tetrarch right away. So let me think like Antipas. I know how to multiply the loaves in the beautiful valleys around Sepphoris. Supposing I learned how to multiply the fishes. Supposing I moved my capital, I'd call it Tiberias, of course, out of respect for the new emperor, but I'll move it to the seashore. I'll control the fishing. So Antipas's drive to become king of the Jews, that's my interpretation. But the fact is, he moves his capital, he moves it to the seashore, he names it Tiberias. He could, of course, have renamed Sepphoris Tiberias and put up a nice big triumphal arch. That would be fine for the new council. You don't have to move it. So I'm thinking what he's doing is commercializing the lake. That's my interpretation of the facts. He's over there to commercialize the lake. And we see why that's important. So moving to this. This is the coins that he struck for the founding of Tiberias, the city, say the year 19 to 20. look at them. I superimposed the coins on a shot of the Sea of Galilee, of the reeds at the shore of the Sea of Galilee. You see the reed on the coin. You can see it over there. There's a reed on the coin. He's very careful, by the way. He does not put his own face on the coin. So he's following certain Jewish sensitivities, of course. So the reed is there, and the reed is in the lake. So this is his symbol for the lake. Tiberias, you can see on the back of the coin, the name. That, by the way, is what the Q Gospel is up to when it talks about John the Baptist and says, do you go out in the desert to look for a quivering, shaking reed, a reed shaking in the wind? Well, first of all, nobody in their right mind goes looking for reeds in the desert, particularly. That's a jibe, a calculated jibe at the reed guy, Antipas, the reed guy, the lake guy. Let me go to give you a close-up of that coin. If you look at it counterclockwise, starting down around, say, 5 o'clock, you can see tetrarchu all the way around it. And then going clockwise, Herodu on the other side of it. And in the middle, not his face, of course, but the symbol of his city, the reed. And look at the back, Tiberias with the wreath around it, symbol of, if you will, victory or something like that. So this is a typical coin that celebrated the founding of his new city. Take a look at this image. Go back to what I said before. Imagine again that you are, this is a picture, by the way, painted by Balázs, but taken from the 200s. It's from a Sepphoris. It's a magnificent villa at Sepphoris. You can see it's a triclinium. You see the 3 couches for the honored guests. The main, the host is sort of with his back to us, and then there's honored guests to left and right, and the other people would be sitting around or standing around. And you can see they all have their little tables and everything else. That, of course, is not a carpet. It's marble flooring. Now, I want you to think for a second. Go back to what I said. Imagine what his aristocratic counselors are going to think about him moving his capital. What do you do at a villa like that? I'm not sure there was something as luxurious as that at the time of Jesus at Sepphoris, but there were ones, at least, very luxurious. So you can understand why immediately opposition to this new city rose. There were rumors going around that he had built it on a graveyard, as impure as you could imagine. He wouldn't have done that. I mean, this is Antipas, who was a prudent, foxy, in the old sense of the word, foxy emperor or ruler, for 40 years. He didn't put his face on the coin. He wouldn't have built over a graveyard. Why would you do that? Nor would he have done the other rumor that all the images inside his palace were against Jewish custom. This is typical opposition that you get when a politician or a ruler does something that everyone is against. So I emphasize again, there had to be a serious, profoundly serious Roman reason for moving his capital. Now look at Jesus. Isn't it interesting? Almost exactly the same pattern occurs. What you have, first of all, as we saw, is Antipas moves from inland Sepphoris, about 4 miles from Nazareth, by the way, all the way to the coast. That's where the star is, at Tiberias. And all of a sudden, the Sea of Galilee, or the Lake of Galilee, becomes the Sea of Tiberias. Jesus moves from inland Nazareth to Capernaum on the lakeshore. Again, what's he up to? What's wrong with Nazareth? Nazareth is probably a sight more healthy operation. It's high up in the Nazareth Ridge. You move over to Capernaum, you're on lakeshore, and where lakeshore, you get marshes and you get those reeds, and when you get them, you get mosquitoes. No wonder Jesus is going to spend his time around the lake healing people, and much less business at Nazareth. It's a far healthier climate up there. So anyway, watch those 2 patterns. from inland to the lake for Antipas, for inland to the lake for Jesus. It's not accidental. This is a shot again by Balaj of what we're imagining at Nazareth. Tiny, tiny little ridge up in the Nazareth ridge. Village, hamlet, not big. Even that jibe in John's gospel about can anything good come from there? The typical sneer of the town against the village and the village against the hamlet. Not always the wisest sneer to make. But the same way then, I'm repeating, Antipas moves, Jesus moves. And you remember, of course, what you have in Matthew's gospel. Jesus left Nazareth and made his home in, by the way, that's not one of my pictures. I wish I'd taken a picture as good as that. Jesus left Nazareth, made his home in Capernaum by the Sea of Galilee. I would think that's a major question. Why Jesus did that, the people should ask and scholars should ask, what's there? What's he doing? This is again from Balaj. It's an example of what we could imagine Capernaum looked like. You can see the dried, salted fish up there, but the cat won't even look at them. And buildings made very rough from stone, field stone, but on the lake. Now we start to get into it. We're looking today, of course, at the Yigal Alon Museum in Kibbutz Ginosar. The reason it's there is because he was a member of that kibbutz, and he was, as you probably know, a famous general and archaeologist, warrior archaeologist. And this is in his memory, built there. And it is where the Galilee boat, a first century Galilee boat, is now housed. Some fast background. In 1986, the levels of the Sea of Galilee, the Lake of Tiberias, were lowered because of a drought. And in the mud off the shoreline, the two, I would call them amateur archaeologists because they were interested in archaeology, two members of the kibbutz, Moshe and Nufan Yuval. Jonathan and I met Moshe in 1999. We were there. Went seeing what they could find, and they saw the gunnels of a boat in the mud, and they knew immediately they had an old boat because they could see how some of it was built. So a first century boat. And then as luck would have it, the water started to come towards it and endanger the whole thing. So almost immediately they had to encase the whole boat. It's described as the excavation from hell. They had to do a salvage operation, encase it in actually, I don't even know the term, like foam rubber, as it were, and have the whole boat moved, sailed over to the museum, where it had to be encased for 10 years, from 86 to 96, in a vat of conservation fluids. I know I read what they're in there, but I can't even remember it, to get all the water leached out and other stuff put in so the whole thing didn't disintegrate into fragments. So it took 10 years. We saw it once when it was in its conservation vat, and then of course it's now there. So it's a first century boat. And let me insist on why this is so important. It's not a proof of anything. It's a symbol of everything. Let me just look at this when I'm talking. I think that's right. I didn't go too far. Okay, sorry, the next one. Just take a look at it. It was a 27-foot boat, and without a doubt, it was the workhorse boat of the Sea of Galilee in the first century. It would be the boat that is certainly imagined when Jesus is with his disciples in a boat. Some people said, well, it's exactly the right size to hold 13 people. But you know, if a couple of them are walking on the waters, you wouldn't know who's in the boat and who's out of the boat. So that's not the point. Whether it's the Jesus boat, as it's being called, no, it is the type of boat that you're imagining when you're reading this, the workhorse boat of the Sea of Galilee, 27 foot long. What's fascinating about this boat is this. Now, look, it's only one boat. You could say, but that doesn't prove anything. One boat doesn't prove anything. No, it's not a proof. It's a symbol. If you go over, a couple of years ago, we were lecturing in Cuba, in Havana. And if you looked at any of those, I don't want to say boats, look at some of those cars from the 50s and the 60s in America, you would know two things. They have to have the greatest mechanics in the world in Havana. And you would also know the whole sociology of the situation. Why are they still using old American cars? You know why? Because they can't get parts on new cars. So I'm looking at this in the same way. This is a boat that was kind of nursed to keep it afloat by excellent boatwrights, first-rate boatwrights working with totally inadequate material. So it's a symbol for me, as I'll say, of the economic squeeze on the Sea of Galilee. What happened was the main city for Tiberias is called Tarachae or Tarachae. It sometimes is equated with Magdala. It shouldn't be, by the way. It is not Magdala. It is not Magdala. It's the main village or even town that was there before Tiberius arrived. And offshore of that, apparently there was a boatwright business there. When the boat couldn't be kept afloat anymore, when they couldn't nurse it any longer, they took off the stem posts, the stern posts, the oars, of course, the mast, maybe a lot of the nails even, and they simply pushed it out into the lake to die. It didn't go down in a storm, and my suspicion is there's a lot more lake boats out there too. It was simply allowed to die. But watch, looking at it, for me, to be honest with you, was always something like a sacrament. There's nothing to do with, oh, Jesus sat in this, but nothing to do with that at all. It made me feel for the community of ordinary people on the Sea of Galilee, which under the squeeze of commercialization, were trying to survive. And I know many scholars say, oh, everything was booming under Antipas and the Sea of Galilee, but please, ask not for whom the boom booms. It may not boom for thee. So of course an economy can be booming for some people. Don't we really have to go back 2,000 years to know that a booming economy can mean a lot of unemployment? So I'm looking at this boat as almost a sacramental revelation of the economic squeeze. These are the best shots I could get of it. And you see it's all protected so you can get around it and imagine it. I focus mostly on close-ups of it rather than on showing the museum, because the museum is a lot of discussions about whether this is the Jesus boat and a lot of other stuff. Okay, sorry, let me go back. Okay, this is taken off the museum wall. It's a magnificent illustration. Focus on the boat and what I'm calling the economic squeeze. This was originally a very, very good boat. The original woods had oak frames, Tabor oak, that's solid stuff, oak frames, and the planks along the sides were cedar of Lebanon. That's a very good boat. But then when you look at all those colors, and if we wanted to, we could show every single different one of those colors is a different wood. Here's what you get. 10 different types of repair wood. It's patched, almost like by whatever they can find. So you've 12 types of woods, the two main ones, and then the patchwork. And there's a lot of patchwork, and 10 different types. Now, the only reason you do that is because you're kind of using scrap wood almost to keep this poor old boat afloat. And I'm interpreting. Now, this is the fact. We have a boat, and this is what it looks like. This is my interpretation. This is a symbol for me of the economic squeeze for small fishers under Antipas's commercialization of the now Lake of Tiberias. So my interpretation of what Antipas is up to is perfectly reasonable from his point of view. His strategy, this is interpretation, his strategy is to become king of the Jews, which we know, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, we know that in general. How is he going to do it? Well, he can't squeeze his peasantry anymore. That revolts him. Could he commercialize the lake? Now, commercializing the lake means moving the city of Tiberias, or creating the city of Tiberias to control it, setting up probably factories for dried fish, for salted fish, for fish sauce, garum, and not selling this around Galilee. This now goes into the, what's the term? Globalization of Mediterranean commercialization. He would now take his stuff to Tyre and send it across the Mediterranean. Now, that puts a squeeze on small fishers. They probably are going to have to pay a fee to have their own boat if they can still have it, to launch their own boat if they can still launch it, to give their fish probably to his fish factories, probably at his price, if it's even allowed to do all of that. He's commercializing the lake. That is the only sense that I can get for what Antipas is doing. And what Antipas does, as I said, within his three imperial rulers, with all of whom he tried to become king of the Jews. Let me go a little bit wider. When you look at maps of the Mediterranean, and you look at, the red circle that's the Roman Empire, like a donut around the whole of the Mediterranean, HOLE. What Rome is doing is not just accumulating land so it'll be a nice little circle. This is globalization. This is Mediterranean globalization. And please don't think I'm just trying to use a modern term. At the end of the Bronze Age, as far as we can tell from some of the ships at the bottom of the Mediterranean, there was a globalization for that whole area. That is, commerce and business was working on a very wide swath. Roman imperialism was Mediterranean globalization. Get with the program. Of course, it was done by urbanization, then by commercialization, and as far as you could do it, by industrialization. As you may know, the lead mines and the silver mines in Spain put enough stuff into the air, which we can find now in ice cores from Greenland. There was more stuff in the air of the Mediterranean under Rome than there would be again till the Industrial Revolution came along. Mediterranean globalization is what Antipas is getting into. And of course, that that's what his father, Herod the Great, was doing by building that magnificent port at Caesarea. The port was called Sebastus, by the way. Let me put it the other way. He built the port of Sebastus and the city of Caesarea. That's the proper order. He didn't build a city, he happened to have a port. He built a port. He's getting into the Roman program of globalization by ports, all-weather roads, all-weather bridges. He's getting with the system. Antipas is trying to do in his own little way what his father did and trying to get into the Roman urbanization system. Good news for him, of course. Bad news for small fishers, for peasants who could go down and supplement their income with protein from the lake. All right. Let me go back. I think I jumped too. So here's the question. And it's the point where the tradition and the traction meet together. If you have tradition without traction, it's lame. If you have traction without tradition, it's blind. If you want to have Occupy the Lake, which is Jesus' program, Occupy the Lake, you're telling people, they've been hearing for 500 years about God's justice for earth and God's rule is coming. And we've been listening to that for 500 years. We're getting bored waiting. But the question is, now there's traction. This is not right. This is not fair, says a fisher on the Sea of Galilee. I did nothing wrong. I was able to launch my boat. It took 4 families maybe to come together. We this poor old boat that we kept afloat. What did we do wrong? Now, that's the danger point when tradition and traction come together. When all this lovely talk about the justice of God and distributive justice and God's rule for earth, all lovely stuff, comes down and takes on a local habitation and a name, as Shakespeare said. And a question like this might be asked. Well, if the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, whose is the lake and all of its fishes? And that type of question is a question, of course, that raises treason. Not violent treason, but yeah, who owns the lake? Who owns the fishes? So don't think the fact that Jesus in John 21 could take a huge haul of fishes out of the lake is just, oh, what a lovely miracle. What a piece of treason. So now let me take all of that and put it, as we come towards our conclusion, in a wider frame of reference. In a frame of reference, not just for Jesus, but for all of any historical event worth recording. It could be Steve Jobs inventing the iPhone, is going to work with 4 things. Tradition. By that, I mean simply all the stuff that everyone takes for granted. Steve Jobs didn't have to invent the telephone, come up with it. Tradition is the way, when you grow up, people tell you this is the way of the world. Okay, that's the way it is. By vision, I mean somebody who has a different angle on things. Maybe the tradition is turned on its head or just changed this way, or maybe it's radical, maybe it's just partial, but a vision against the tradition. Now, it could be an interaction with it. It doesn't have to be a revolution or something. It could be. And the time and place has to be right. So to understand Jesus, to understand that Galilee boat, you have to understand the tradition. That's everything about the Roman matrix. That's everything have to do with Mediterranean globalization. It's everything have to do with Herod the Great getting with the program, and his son Antipas, who wanted to be as good as his father, trying to get with the program. That's all of. Then you have the vision, the angle to do it. Maybe Antipas could have done it some other way. That's the vision. Now, the time and place. It makes no sense except for the time of Mediterranean globalization and for place. And by the way, the reason I put that with a image of the stars and behind it is that this historical creativity, this is for anything. This is nothing special about Jesus, by the way. He has to fit into this. The matrix of evolution is actually where the matrix of history comes from. Instead of tradition, put matter. Instead of vision, put energy. Instead of time and place, simply put time and space. And you have the matrix of evolution, the Big Bang, if you prefer it. So whenever you're dealing with any historical event, watch what's given, what's new, and why there and why then. And let me then look at all 4 of those. What's the tradition, as I see it? The tradition there for Jesus. It's the tradition of divine rule, or God's kingdom. I'm using divine rule to avoid the kind of archaic term and the patriarchal term, kingdom. Divine rule as interventionist eschatology. Now, what I mean by interventionist eschatology is exactly what John the Baptist held, that any day now, God is going to come and divine rule is going to be ushered in on the world, and we're getting ready for it. What I understand John is doing is he's taking people out into the desert, taking them across the Jordan, and as the water washes their bodies, repentance washes their soul, and he's bringing them into the promised land as if they're returning from exile. He's reenacting the exile. That's his program. But he's waiting for God to do it. That's John's program. It's not Jesus's program. At least it wasn't eventually Jesus's program. So if I go to the vision, I'm looking at the vision of Jesus, over against the tradition and those who would have agreed with John that God is going to do it. We can pray for it, we can hope for it, we can wait for it, but we can do nothing about it except that, prepare for it. The vision of Jesus is this: God's rule, the divine rule, or God's kingdom, if you use that, is a collaborative eschatology. You guys, Jesus might have said, are waiting for God because that's what you've been told to do. But the trouble is that God is waiting for you. That's why it's never working. You got two people waiting for each other in different places, as it were. As if you were on a date and you didn't have a cell phone and two people are in different restaurants waiting for it. It's never going to happen. So that's what I see as the vision of Jesus in interaction with the tradition. Of course, it presumes on the tradition, but it's a definite vision on the tradition. And what about the other two? Time. Early first century Romanization, again, Romanization as globalization of Israel. And as I'm talking to you right now, I'm slightly distracted by listening to the wind, which is coming up. Time of Jesus, Romanization. It's not that Israel is so precious, but it's the land bridge between Syria to the north and Egypt to the south. It's hard to imagine more important bread baskets for Rome. And in the non-sailing season, that's the way the armies would have to connect. So it's terribly important as part of the globalization program. And then, of course, by now, you know, from what I've told you already, the place, Antipas's commercialization of the Sea of Galilee as the Lake of Tiberias to bring its fishers and bring its fish rather into the globalization of the Mediterranean. So basically, that is my presentation. I don't think there's anything else. That's 31. So we can go back and we can organize ourselves for questions as soon as Trip can.
All right.
Can do it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that was wonderful, Dom. Thank you. Thank you. So I want to let everyone know that streaming, you can insert questions wherever you're at, and I'll be able to collect them. Those of you that decide to send them into my Twitter DM, there's always that option too, but I'm glad I noticed. Now, there are a couple questions that came in early on in the first half that I think that could really help frame the particular way you unpacked the Galilee boat. For those that may be new to this larger historical matrix of Israel and the Rome and the way the Herods are playing back in it, could you give a few kind of touchstones for what the ongoing relationship is of the people of Israel to the Roman domination system that Herod and company are inheriting and dealing with the locals in a sense?
Now, presuming what I call Romanization, which is getting this integrated global idea, what Rome usually did when they took over a place, if they could, they would keep what we might call a puppet king. They would say a client king, because the ruler knew how to do it. Now, it's not going to work in Egypt, of course, because Cleopatra, but they appointed her. They get what we might call a strong man. Rome figured out this guy is powerful and ruthless enough to control the Jewish homeland. They put in her the Great. It was formal. He came to Rome. It was in when Anthony and Octavian were still friends. they declared him King of the Jews. That was his official title. They took him up to the Capitoline Temple of Jupiter, offered sacrifice. It was all terribly Roman. He came back to be King of the Jews, if he could make it. So he was their client king. The two big things he did immediately was he started that great port at Caesarea Maritima, as they said, the port of Sebastos. That would probably, he's up to kind of compete in his own little way with Alexandria to maybe make this a major port that Romans would come into the Jewish homeland, and then he would hope to put up Roman bridges and Roman. He's getting with the infrastructure of the empire. That's the first thing you have to do. All-weather ports, all-weather roads, all-weather bridges. So no matter what happens, they don't get washed out, and the military can move. The Persians had great roads. When it rained, they had mud. You don't move military over mud, or you move them much more slowly. So he's getting with the system. He also, of course, is doing huge work on the temple to keep his own people happy. Okay, so when he dies in 4 BCE, by the way, there's explosions all over the country. It's like a pressure cooker that blows. Who's going to be the successor? This was a huge problem that Augustus had. And Augustus thought of Herod as a friend in the technical Roman sense of an amicus. And Herod had wanted maybe the country divided between his sons or something like that. So faced with all of this, Augustus decided, as I said, okay, I'll divide the country between them. Philip in the northeast, and Antipas, Galilee and Perea, and Samaria, Judea, and Idumea, I'll give to Archelaus. All of that was set in 4 BCE. Now, Archelaus was disastrous. As you know, by 6 CE, he was dumped, and a Roman procurator, sub-governor, was put in. But Antipas was still doing fine up in Galilee. So you're dealing with client kings who are kept in as long as they're doing good. When they're no longer doing good, they're dumped out, and official Roman governors take over. And that's when they do census, for taxation purposes, and that's when you have trouble. So basically, you're dealing with imperial domination. But again, let me stress that domination doesn't work by just beating up people. That's too expensive. You can't keep a military if its main job is beating up people. What you're trying to do is, you may use euphemisms like free trade, which means we trade freely. You do what you're told. So everything I see in Antipas in the year 20, to give a round number, makes absolute sense. If Jesus never existed and John never existed, except I would be wondering, if nobody said anything, what's happening to them? They're fishers. Are they all happy? And then when I read Jesus, and I find that his first clients, his first followers, are all fishers, and they're all in the northwest quadrant of the Sea of Galilee between, say, Tiberias. I think, I couldn't invent this. That's what I would expect to happen. So if he wants to get going with his movement, get out of Nazareth, they're doing okay over there. Move over where the action is. So what I find is that my way of handling Jesus is I don't really start with the Gospels. I can't let on I don't know them. I really can't. But I spent all my time trying to figure out what Antipas is doing, writing a thick description of the Sea of Galilee in the 20s. And into that, then do I see, well, this makes sense. His first ones would be like this. They wouldn't be up in Jerusalem searching the scripture. That'll come later. That's his traction. So that's what I meant by tradition and traction.
No, I think that's super helpful. And one of the just looking at all the previous books you've written, sitting behind you, one of the elements in Jesus' vision, you drew briefly this contrast between John the Baptist, where his ministry outside the city, the baptism was a kind of purification to get ready for divine intervention coming to set things to right, and you contrasted it with Jesus' vision of a collaborative eschatology, where kind of the faithful participate in the coming of God's rule. I wonder if you could kind of give a brief vision of how, as a historical Jesus scholar wrestling with the teachings and texts of Jesus, that particular understanding of the divine rule gets argued, because I think your vision that you've argued plenty of other places gets deeply enhanced with this particular, right, like Galilee boat. You could see the way the solidarity of Jesus gets materialized under Herod Antipas. But I'm guessing some people may not be familiar with the 4 or 5 books specifically about Jesus' divine vision.
Yeah, if I could move, let's say we've got Antipas straight now. Let's say John and Jesus don't exist yet. So we got Antipas down. We know what he's up to. Now let me look at John and forget Jesus now. We're focusing on John. And no, what John is doing is not telling about Jesus. He's telling about God. The one who's coming, as far as John is concerned, ain't Jesus. It's God. So he is a typical apocalyptic expectation. And the background of that, or the matrix, is that if you were living in the first century and you've been told this stuff about God's rule and God's coming, and you've watched empires get stronger and stronger. I mean, you thought Alexander was the worst thing you could imagine, at least in your history, and along come the Romans. And they don't look like they're moving on either. So where's this God's rule? It's kind of like rubbish. And why should we believe that stuff when Rome is ruling and getting rulier every day? Now, what John has is a message that does make sense. A prophet standing up in the first century saying, God is coming soon. You
Uh-oh. I wonder if the hurricane has captured Dom's internet. We'll give him a second, see if he pops back on here. Or maybe mine's completely out. Hey, y'all are all seeing me, right? Someone in the chat want to make because oh yeah, it looks like it is. He's frozen. He said if it happens, he was raptured. Well played, well played. He said he had his hotspot ready to go. If this happened, we'll see if that works. If not, he said he's going to restart it if this happened. But while that's happening, I'll tell you something that's really cool. Dom and I are planning to do these kind of visual presentations over Advent together. We are going to be looking at all the different Christmas stories over Advent. And he's been preparing the like these kind of presentations with all the different pictures he's taken on his journeys, different archeological sites and stuff, to look at the different infancy stories of Jesus and Luke and Matthew, how they're different and things. Look at it in this historical matrix in framing. And I was like, we thought that would be a good idea. And just watching this, I'm like, this is literally the best idea. I'm sure you all know I'm a giant Dominic Crossan fan. He's been on the podcast a bunch of times. But if you want to check out the class, I just finished building kind of like the initial preview thing on the website. But it is crossanthroughadvent.com. If you're on YouTube, I think there's a link in it. Facebook doesn't let me leave messages directly through here, but it's crossanthroughadvent.com. It's gonna be tons of fun. And by the way, we are going to definitely pick this conversation up if his hotspot. I imagine there's a correlation between hotspot activity and internet and electricity going out, but we'll definitely pick this whole thing back up and maybe start with just all the questions and such, because he was on a roll. But one of the questions that came in, since it is specifically more theological, Michael's question is, I wonder how this kind of history can be powerful for liberation theology. Now, for those that may not be like extremely familiar with liberation theology, a number of them emerge. Like you get, say, Black liberation theology in America emerges when the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement kind of give birth to James Cone, and then it opens up and womanist theology comes out of it. But also Latin American liberation theology and someone like Gustavo Gutierrez. Here comes Dom. We'll see.
All right. What I did was go all the way back and start all over again. It dropped us for some reason. My electricity is doing fine. It's just dropped us.
Oh, okay. All right.
I think I'm back.
Well, I started telling them all sorts of things. I said, hey, they're all having fun with this. And I said, we are going to be doing this. Did he freeze again? He did. Well, though, we'll see if he disappears. So the liberation theology, that the question Michael asked are what happens when the actual experience of people on the underside of a domination system begin to read the scriptures and reflect on the solidarity of God through the history of Israel and in the person of Jesus. So take the big story of the Exodus. God chooses sides, right? God takes sides against Pharaoh in the Egyptian domination system and solidarity with the cries of the oppressed, right? So Moses, when asking, who is it that sends me? Right. And God gives God's name. And then who and why did God show up and encounter Moses? Because he heard the cries, like the character of God in that story. So take that. Then you think of the way in which, we're going to try again.
I'm back. I think I'm back. Can you hear me?
Oh, I can hear you.
Okay. And I can hear you. So I think we're all right.
All right.
I've shifted over to a hotspot, so I've got it working.
Okay. Excellent. The so when you disappeared, I told them we were planning on doing these kind of visual presentations during Advent, and I'm pretty excited about it. But we can mention that again at the end, because I want to make sure we get a few questions in case the hurricane takes you out for good, Dom. Oh no.
Sorry.
I'm pretty sure none of us are in charge of the hurricane.
Yeah,
anyway,
no.
When you went out, you were drawing a contrast between you're starting to tell how historical Jesus scholars see Jesus's vision of the divine rule in contrast to the kind of interventionist the interventionist kind of eschatology that John the Baptist represents.
Yeah. And the problem is that for many scholars, and scholars whom I esteem and revere, they say, well, that's what everyone is thinking at the time. So, of course, Jesus is saying the same thing as everyone else. And my answer is, well, it's always possible for somebody, as I said, to have a vision that is in interaction with the tradition and even contradicts it. But here's the fact that I have to work with. We know, I think historically, at least I think we do, and most scholars do, that Jesus started off his public career as a disciple of John the Baptist. And no, I don't have to exalt his CV and make him a second in command or anything else. He simply starts off by being baptized. So for as long as he was under the water, he's accepting John's vision, and that's interventionist eschatology. There's no way that can be explained away. Now, on the other hand, when we hear Jesus speaking with his own voice in, say, the Q Gospel, we hear stuff like, the greatest person that ever lived is John the Baptist, but the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater. That's exactly how you talk about a revered mentor with whom you no longer agree. If you had somebody under whom you've done your doctoral dissertation and you don't agree with that person anymore, you say something like that. Very, very great scholar. But so I understand that Jesus must have changed. There's no other way he underwent a conversion. Maybe he was on the road to Damascus or something. He must have had a conversion. And the conversion had to be John said that John said that God was coming soon, and what actually came was Antipas's cavalry. And John died, and God did nothing. Now, for anyone who's thinking, and that's always the danger in theology, they're going to say, well, there's something wrong here. If God's this interventionist God, couldn't God have moved it up a week or two to beat the execution at Machaerus, you know? So I think Jesus underwent a conversion, which is, we've got it wrong. You people are expecting God to do it for you, or God to do it. And it's not working, clearly. It hasn't worked for John. God, we have to have a different vision of God. And the only one I can imagine, the only way, honestly, I can imagine Jesus saying, as lots of scholars think he did, that God's rule is already here. I mean, unless that's a really cruel joke and not funny. It's like telling, people in the middle of a hurricane, oh, the weather's lovely. That's not funny. It really isn't. When people are dying and suffering, it's not funny to tell them at that moment everything is fine, maybe in the future. But so I can't imagine Jesus saying, God's rule is already here, without somebody saying, you are absolutely nuts and you're not funny. You ain't a stand-up Jewish comedian, Jesus. This isn't funny. How can you say God's rule is here? Tiberius is still in charge. Antipas, the whole usual suspects are all around. The only way I can understand Jesus saying that is to say, it is here, but only if we collaborate with it. So it's not here automatically. It's not here interventionally. It's here by participation and collaboration. And I can imagine lots of people hearing that and saying, that's tough. In one sense, it's almost better waiting for God to do it for you. That means we have to do something. And then almost immediately, I can see 50% of the audience saying, excuse me, Jesus, how long is it going to go on before it's over? That's what we do all the time. I'm listening to the radio all day yesterday. Everyone wanted to know how long before it's over. Other people want to know, what should we do right now? But I understand that is the message of Jesus. Participatory eschatology, if you want to use that term, because basically it's the only thing that makes sense of him for me. It's not a vested interest I have one way or another. So I start with Antipas, then I move to John, who makes sense to me. Then I move to Jesus, who makes sense in terms of John and Antipas. And I can see a program getting going. Now, nothing I've said in this webinar means that, oh, nothing can stop it now. It's going to roar across the road. Of course not. It could have died out in the small villages of Galilee if Jesus hadn't taken it to Jerusalem. Of course, that's another lecture. But if Jesus hadn't gone up to Jerusalem and kept the whole thing quietly around the Sea of Galilee, it wouldn't have survived the war of 66 to 74. So what we have is a first understanding. We've got the beginnings that make sense of a movement. And what happens next is other lectures.
This is kind of a summary to see if I'm right with a question that captures what a couple people asked. But this parallel movement between Herod Antipas taking the capital to the lake, and then turning the resources of the lake, which for the Jewish people are given by God and for and still God's and for the well-being of the whole. That movement of the capital, Herod Antipas' desire to be the king of the Jews, to demonstrate the kind of wealth and control and power that would get the affirmation from the empire he wants, leads to the commercialization of a primary source of nourishment and vocational work. So then the actual resources in the lake that the fishermen have long lived off and worked on are getting processed by Herod and company, and then those resources are being put into the imperial economy and out of the local grassroots space.
That's right, I see it.
So that boat where you see 10 different kinds of wood that originally is built sturdy, coming from, say, a vocation in a community that could care for itself, then is being like jerry-rigged and preserved because the economic push the domination system is putting on them kind of requires this move. And it's in that context that we understand Jesus's move of solidarity to the oppressed at the lake.
Yes, I once said, when you say domination system, we always have to remember that they ain't dominating just to be dominating.
Yeah,
they're dominating for, they might call it free trade. We are free to trade. Well, we are free to trade, and you're free to suffer. You're free to starve, as it were. So watch the people then that are. It's not the poorest of the poor that are Jesus's followers, because they have figured out how to survive, if there are such people on the streets. It's the people who had something yesterday and who know they did nothing wrong. They just followed all the rules and something changed. Well, they're the ones who have a sense this isn't right. And that can go to it's not right for me. Well, the whole system isn't right. And that's where you get huge movements going, and they may become violent. In this case, I think they are not programmatically nonviolent, by the way, but of course they're dangerous because there's activism involved in all of this.
Well, what's fascinating about that, and you made the joke during it about the Occupy the Lake movement.
Yeah.
But the Occupy movement, especially if you look at the long-term trends on responses to surveys about economic possibilities, the American dream, all these things of thinking middle class, generation to generation, the middle class in America is experiencing a squeeze where the opportunities and possibilities available to them, are they recognized or not there for them? The amount of debt the next generation has is higher. I mean, we all are familiar with this, and it's interesting that the squeeze of people that thought the system, what they believed, the story it was selling, then those are the people most likely to question the viability of kind of neoliberal current economic system in America.
They really are.
And
I even say, Trip, I cannot be absolutely certain that that isn't motivating me to see this. Somebody could say, well, you're just projecting, possibly I wouldn't have seen this 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Globalization, I mightn't even have thought about it. I might have thought globalization is lovely. Everyone, what is that? The rising tide raises all boats. No, it raises the yachts and swamps the rowboats. That's what it does. So there is a loop going on here. And some scholars may be perfectly happy with Antipas's globalization because it's a boom. Of course it's a boom. Is he impoverishing all of Galilee? Of course he's not impoverishing all of Galilee, but he is changing the system for who gets the stuff and who controls the stuff. And if you have a theology, which most people have, that it's God's world and should be ruled fairly and distributed fairly, then you have an explosive situation. So it's not surprising to me that 4 times in the first 200 years of the Romanization, you have major revolutions. What does surprise me is that you also have the invention of nonviolent resistance from the Jews themselves in that same period.
Yeah. And for those that are that the kind of emergence of nonviolent resistance as an option, if people are interested in that, you have you've written quite a bit on it, and your newest book, Render Under Caesar, explores it. There's a previous conversation we've had about it, but I wonder, like, the kind of themes that you're touching on just by kind of like setting this particular boat in a historical matrix, like kind of. If you take the big exhale as a viewer, seeing all this play out, how does a gift of that kind of framing something we could anticipate thinking about when turning to look at the different Christmas stories and such together over Advent. Like what does the historical matrix do when picking up these different narratives that most of us experience smashed together in a Christmas pageant, where with towels on kids and crowns on their cousins.
Yeah, everything's lovely. A lot of times when I'm doing a podcast, the interviewer will ask me question A, question B, and I always seem to have an answer. Well, part of it is because I'm always working from a matrix. I mean, you start with the bigger picture. If you start, say, by opening up Matthew, and you just read Matthew 1 and 2, I mean, there's no reason not to think that, of course, Herod the Great, he killed all the kids of Bethlehem. That's the type of thing he would do. Look what he did with his own children. If you start with the bigger picture, then the smaller pieces fall into place. If you start with the small pieces, you can make it up as you go along. And that's great fun. But as I said, I think to you before, that's like playing basketball without a hoop. It's great fun because everyone's as good as everyone else. But opinion without evidence is simply bias or gossip, if you prefer. So I'm always trying to see, okay, before I get into Jesus or Paul or anyone else, supposing I was to try and imagine what I call a thick description, almost sociological description of what life was like in the Romanization process in the first century, for those the haves and the have-nots and the in-betweens, for everyone. Then I look at the Jesus tradition and see what parts really fit in there. So the part that really fits for me immediately is the first followers as being fishers. That makes absolute sense. If all the first followers were Jewish scholars studying the scriptures and wanting to know that Jesus fulfilled the scriptures, I would have to say I don't understand how that worked. I just don't understand. If that's the way it was, we're missing something. Jesus must have been a major scholar or something. I wouldn't understand it. I just wouldn't understand. It was like saying, I grew up in Ireland in the 30s and 40s. Well, if you know Ireland in the 30s and 40s, that gives you expectations about how the Republic of Ireland was, the Irish Free State. And if all of a sudden I'm totally different and don't fit into that, then something is wrong somewhere. So I work very much the same with regard to Jesus. I'm watching the matrix first. And of course, the matrix of the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, 60s keeps changing. So if I'm trying to imagine Matthew in, say, the 80s, or even Luke in the early, I'm imagining a different matrix for them. But that image of the Big Bang, as it were, matter, energy, time, and space, like the shape of a cross, tradition, vision, time, and place. That's a matrix in which I watch everything, including, if we were trying to figure out today why this might be a good way of doing it, doing a visual presentation. This is, in a way, testing something. The tradition might tell me, and I have friends who tell me, no, you always talk. The sermon is the sermon rule. It's the word. No, I'm saying in the beginning is the image. Okay, we're testing that. We're testing that. And when we do the ones for Advent, the testing was, do people like this, where you're getting images, not just taken from Wikipedia or Shutterstock, but images of the time and place that helps people. Does it help? But we're testing it.
Well, I think one of the reasons I find it so helpful, and like digging in just to this one archaeological discovery, like opens up the way in which, if you take Jesus seriously, if you are wanting to be a follower of Jesus, then it kind of demands us to take seriously the kind of solidarity he practiced in his own life, and not to abstract him from the historical matrix, to then make our confessions of him and our commitment to him compatible with the kind of power structures in our own day that continue to oppress others. And when you start to think about that, it's amazing to me how commodified and commercialized and how Christmas, in the way we engage the stories, is so disassociated from those historical matrix that personally am super pumped to to have multiple sessions digging in to setting those texts in historical context and setting the story of the coming of Christ in that rich, deep, thick account, because the commercialized Christmas is kind of gross.
Yeah, let me give you something connecting. For example, the Magi, they're supposed to be coming all the way guided by a star, right? Now, all of a sudden, we forget the star, they come to Jerusalem, and they have to ask for directions. We all know men don't ask for directions in any case. So they ask for directions. That brings Herod into the story, Herod the Great, by the way, into the story. So that's why they have to stop with Herod, otherwise he's not in the story. Then they ask him, where is the newborn king of the Jews? Now, that's the dumbest question any wise person ever asked a king. Where's the newborn king of the Jews? Herod's official title, it's in Josephus, is king of the Jews. They're asking about a newborn king of the Jews. That's the recipe for getting them killed in the sense, in any case. The next time in Matthew's gospel, you find king of the Jews mentioned is on the cross above Jesus. And Herod the Great, what does Jesus do? He flees into Egypt. He flees from Israel into Egypt. So now, wait a minute. There's a story about Moses, a newborn kid who almost gets killed by a bad Pharaoh, and he flees eventually from Egypt into Israel. Now we have a Pharaoh. Now Herod, king of the Jews, is the new Pharaoh, and we're exiting in the other direction. We're fleeing into Egypt. Not to read this as political dynamite. It's absurd. I mean, they could have fled lots of other places besides Egypt to get away from Herod. So to ignore all that and take the Magi and tuck them into the crib and, shaking hands with the shepherds, it's an insult to Matthew, please. And it's an insult to the author who wrote that. If you take it seriously, and this is part of why we do not take it seriously, Chip, there is latent political dynamite in there. There really is. That's why these people who wrote this sort of stuff, a lot of them ended up dead, because they were criticizing radically the status quo. They were doing it non-violently, but they were doing it.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, and I'm really excited about I'm really excited about getting to explore that this Advent. For those of you on the live stream or listening later, you can join up. Just go to crossanthrough.advent.com. That would be his last name. Through advent.com, and they'll get all the info about how to join us. And definitely through it, we'll get these visual presentations. You'll also be able to engage in the book Dom wrote with Marcus Borg called The First Christmas. And the people will be able to do it individually in an online group, or use the content and facilitate it in small groups in your congregations. The live visual lectures will take place each Monday of Advent, so that if you're a congregation or in a discussion group, you can use the recording anytime that week and be able to do it, or you can all join live on Monday afternoons. But yeah, I'm just, anyway, I've really enjoyed getting to do this, and excited about spending time looking at the Christmas stories. Do you have knowing what all is going to take place, going through things this Advent? What kind of questions do you think people should be carrying or thinking about if they're getting excited or anticipating joining the group?
Part of what we're going to do is try and look at Matthew by itself and Luke by itself. Look at the differences, not in any kind of adolescent glib way of saying, oh, they got this wrong, but to try and understand, what is this author up to? What are they trying to do? And what I'm going to be arguing is that basically these are what I'm calling parabolic overtures. An overture is not just a prologue, it's a sort of a beginning that gives you a glimpse of the whole, a summary of the whole. And they're parables. If you say, for example, do I think there was a slaughter of the innocents in Bethlehem? Do I think there was a flight into Egypt? I will say no. The same way I don't think there was a good Samaritan, I don't think there was a prodigal son. But when Jesus wanted to say something about God, he went into a fiction. We call it a parable, but the parable is a fiction. So they're telling fiction to start their story, to summarize their story about, of course, real people. Jesus, Mary, Joseph, Herod, the rest of them, the Magi. But if you thought of it, if you ever looked at an ancient manuscript, it's wall-to-wall writing and uncial capitals, and makes your head spin even to get it divided to try and read it, even if you did it in English with all capitals and no stops, you'd go crazy. So you're really grateful to have a little overture up front. This kind of gives you a vision of the whole in the first 18, 20 pages. And every gospel has one, by the way. It's just that Matthew and Luke have a different style of overture. So these were precious to help people get into an ancient manuscript that didn't have, all of our verses and chapters and headings and all the other paraphernalia we have to help a person get into a book. So I would say it's the only proper way to prepare for Christmas, because it's respectful of the first Christmas. It's respectful of Matthew and Luke and those who talked about it. And it's not simply sticking them all together in a crib and isn't that sweet. And the images I will be using are a precious part of it in all cases. They're not simply little background stuff. The same principle will be operation here. The images are chosen in order to be part of the instruction. It's like showing that image of the boat. I could talk about it, obviously. We could have done this and just talked about the boat. But I'm hoping that image will sear your way into people's mind as it does into mine, that fractured boat, as it were. So it's very important that we're testing this to see, will this, what I call visual lectures, or visual classes, because these will be classes. So visual classes, as distinct from simply talking heads.
Yeah. Well, thank you all who have joined today or are watching later. It's been a real blast. Thank you, Dom, for doing this. I'm super excited about Advent. For those of you that joined and maybe missed part of it, or I'm going to edit the video so that it flows where our where Dom disappeared. Luckily, you weren't raptured, Dom. There was some worry.
No, just I snapped on my I got the cell phone here, and I snapped it immediately to iPod, or to what do you call it, hotspot, and immediately it came back on, and I got back to you.
No, I am I'm super excited. So everyone, make sure you go check out crossingthrough-advent.com. You can join up, invite your friends. If you're part of a local community or reading group, feel free to join up. It's going to be a blast, and we will get to talk to you all later. So until then, we will have to say bye for now.
And bye to everyone.